He is 7 years old, standing at the edge of a schoolyard in County Durham, and he cannot make his own name come out his mouth. The other boys have already decided who he is. The strange one, the alien, the boy who talks like his tongue is caught on something. He doesn't fight it. He goes quiet instead, watching from the edges, learning early that silence is safer than trying to speak and failing in front of everyone. What none of them know, what he barely understands himself yet, is that in a few years he will stand in front of a much larger crowd than this one, and the stutter that has haunted every classroom, every dinner table, every attempt at friendship will simply vanish. Not fade, vanish. The moment changes him forever, but not in the way anyone would expect, because decades later, an older man, 70 years old, world famous, one of the most recognized faces on the planet, will sit across from an interviewer and admit something startling. That stepping into character never felt like freedom. It felt like exhaustion. That he dreaded certain roles the way other people dread bad news. That underneath the laughter he built an empire on. There was a man who quietly believed none of it was ever quite good enough. This is the story of how a boy who couldn't speak became the most watched silent performer in the world, and what that silence cost him. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born in the dead of winter, January of 1955, into a farming family in the north of England, the youngest of 4 brothers. But there had already been a loss in that house before he arrived. An older brother, gone as an infant, a grief that settled quietly into the walls long before Rowan understood what it meant. He grew up disciplined, watched over, expected to be sensible. Farms don't have much patience for whimsy. And yet inside that quiet, orderly boy was something that didn't fit the mold at all, a mind that would one day build its living out of pulling faces and falling over furniture. Nobody could have guessed it yet, least of all Rowan, because first there was a stutter. It arrived around age 5 and settled in hard, turning ordinary school days into small daily humiliations. Reading aloud, answering a question, saying his own name, each one a minefield. At Durham Chester School, the other children were not gentle about it. They mocked the way his face moved when he struggled for words, the strange rubbery expressions that came with the effort of speech, and some of them, cruelly, casually, the way children do, called him an alien. A boy sitting in that same schoolroom, a few years younger, would grow up to become one of the most powerful men in Britain. He remembered, even decades later, how hard those years were for the shy, isolated boy with the speech that wouldn't cooperate. Rowan spent most of that time alone, not sulking, just watching, absorbing, learning the geometry of a room, without needing to speak in it. It would turn out to be the most valuable education he ever received, though nobody, including him, recognized it at the time. Then came the discovery that would quietly define the rest of his life. On a stage, reciting lines that weren't his own, wearing an expression that wasn't his face, the stutter disappeared completely. Every trace of it. The boy who couldn't get his own name out could deliver an entire performance without a single stumble, as long as the words belonged to someone else. It was less a cure than a trade. He could only be fluent if he wasn't fully himself. That bargain would follow him his entire career, long after the world had forgotten he ever stuttered at all. He was brilliant academically despite everything. Sharp enough in the sciences to win a place at Newcastle University at 18 to study electrical and electronic engineering, about as far from show business as a path could run. He excelled, graduated, and followed his father into Oxford for a master's degree in an obscure and demanding corner of engineering, the kind of work that suggested a quiet, respectable, entirely unremarkable future. His own tutor later said that Rowan barely stood out in the classroom, but something happened the instant he stepped onto a stage. He became someone else, someone louder, sharper, entirely unafraid, and that someone else was impossible to ignore. It was at Oxford, in a university drama club, that he crossed paths with a young writer named Richard Curtis, and neither of their lives would look the same again. Curtis watched him for the first time at a rehearsal, and initially wrote him off as an odd, quiet figure in the corner of the room. Then Rowan performed, a mime sketch, timed with unnatural precision, and Curtis realized he was watching something rare. Within months they were writing together, performing together, testing an act at the Edinburgh Fringe that would put Rowan in front of a national audience for the first time. The path was suddenly, unmistakably clear. He was not going to be an engineer. He was going to be a performer, whatever that cost him. And it did cost him. The years that followed were not a smooth ascent. They were a slow, grinding series of rejections. The BBC turned him down again and again. A radio show he poured himself into barely found an audience because it aired in a slot nobody was listening to. His stutter, the thing he thought he'd escaped, crept back in during auditions and interviews, resurfacing exactly when he needed his voice the most. There were nights he seriously considered walking away from comedy entirely and going back to something safer, something with blueprints and equations instead of audiences who might not laugh. But he kept returning to that one unshakable fact. On a stage, in character, he was free. So instead of quitting, he doubled down. He built a wall of alternate selves to hide behind, one strange character after another, until hiding became a career. That career nearly didn't survive its own beginning. When the BBC finally gave him a real shot with a new sketch show, the first episode aired to almost no one, and the reviews were savage. One future co-star called it the worst half-hour of television he'd ever sat through. It should have ended there. Instead, against all odds, the network ordered a second series, and that single decision built the foundation for one of the most influential British comedy programs of its era. But success didn't mean peace. Behind the scenes, a castmate was fired over creative disagreements Rowan fought hard against and lost. Budgets were slashed until the show mocked its own poverty on air. And still, in the middle of all that tension, one unscripted burst of fury from a man in a gorilla suit, Rowan, improvising a punchline that became instantly iconic, helped the show win international awards and cement his reputation as a master of physical comedy nobody had trained for and everybody suddenly wanted. By 1982, though, the exhaustion had become unbearable. The show that made him wasn't ended by falling ratings. It was ended because the people inside it, Rowan most of all, had simply run out of themselves to give, rather than milk a hit for money. The whole cast walked away at the peak of their fame, scattering into new projects. For Rowan, that meant Blackadder, a gamble so expensive it nearly got canceled after its first season, saved only by an international award that bought it one more chance. Stripped down, sharpened, and rebuilt around smaller sets and tighter writing, the show transformed into something far better than its shaky start suggested, eventually closing with a war-set finale so devastating in its final moments that it's still remembered as one of the most emotional endings in television history. Rowan later said that particular set was the one time in his career the pressure didn't sit entirely on his shoulders. Everyone carried it together. It was, he admitted, the calmest he'd ever felt making something. Then came the character that would define him to the entire planet, and quietly unmake something inside him at the same time. Mr. Bean barely spoke a word, which meant Rowan could pour every ounce of his craft into his face and his body instead. And the world responded in numbers almost impossible to comprehend. Viewers across 200 countries, a character who needed no translation because he never needed language in the first place. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, Rowan later confessed the truth quietly, almost reluctantly. He didn't enjoy playing character at all. It drained him. He dreaded the responsibility of it, counted down the days until filming ended, and found himself at the height of global adoration, feeling less like a beloved icon and more like a man performing an elaborate, exhausting disguise he couldn't take off. The private cost kept compounding. Even as the public triumphs piled up, a marriage of over 2 decades quietly ended, followed swiftly by tabloid headlines over a new, much younger relationship that the press picked apart without mercy. And true to form, Rowan said almost nothing about any of it, letting silence do what it had always done for him. In the sky over Kenya, he once found himself gripping the controls of a small plane after the pilot fainted mid-flight. A man who had never flown in his life, keeping an aircraft steady out of sheer nerve until it was safe to land, a moment of real, unscripted heroism he barely spoke about afterward. He stood in Parliament and defended free speech to a room that didn't fully agree with him, absorbing criticism from people who accused a gentlest-looking man on television of defending something ugly. He wrote publicly about environmental regret and was accused of hypocrisy for the cars in his own garage. Every few years, another headline. Every few years, the same quiet man refusing to explain himself. And then, decades into playing a character the world thought it understood completely, one final twist arrived. the kind that recontextualizes everything that came before it. Buried in an animated episode, the show finally confirmed what fans had half-joked about for years. Mr. Bean was never entirely human. Clones of him step out of a spaceship. His name was always simply Mr. No first name, as though whoever wrote him understood that human naming conventions never quite applied. The original opening had hinted at it decades earlier, a falling figure and a strange chant nobody thought twice about at the time. It landed online less as trivia, more as a strange, fitting metaphor nobody had asked for, but everybody recognized instantly, because in a way, it had always been true. Rowan Atkinson built an entire career playing a character who didn't belong to this world. Using a body that spoke fluently in a language his own voice had once refused to cooperate with. Now, having crossed 70, having spent over 45 years turning private pain into public joy, he still doesn't describe himself as successful. He questions it, constantly. A man with more awards than he can comfortably list, a character adored on every continent, a legacy that outlived every doubt he ever had about himself. And still, somewhere underneath all of it, the same boy from that schoolyard in Durham, waiting to see if this time the words will come out right. The world already answered that question a long time ago. He just hasn't quite let himself believe it yet.